There is a sacredness to in-between time, when it's no longer past and not yet future, when the way ahead isn't clear. This can be a time for wondering and imagining and looking in every direction at once. And also, it can be a baffling and difficult time. It can be a challenging time. In Southeastern European myth and magical traditions, the goddess of the crossroads is Hecate. And she has 3 interconnected bodies looking in every direction at once. Her symbols were the key and the torch to open the way and illuminate it. Her animals were the dog, watcher and searcher and companion, and the snake, who sheds its skin and transforms. And these are her properties and symbols because they are the experience of the crossroads. They're the things that you need in that in-between moment, the liminal time, the frontier wilderness between this and that, between who you've been and who you're becoming. And she was the guardian then, not just of roads, but of journeys too. Journeys also between life and death, and her keys unlocked the doors behind which lived the ghosts from your past, which still shape the lives of the living. There's a holy movement in that in-between place, standing in the center of the crossroads, a generative sense of possibility, and it's a dangerous place because it's easy to get lost there. And often, the fact is that the in-between time does not feel alive with holy possibility. If you lost your job and the new one is not forthcoming, it rings a little hollow to talk about how beautiful and possible the in-between is. That crossroads of any sort of thing in your life, that crossroads, whether a new year or the space between any loss and the not yet, which hasn't quite come. It can also be a place of bewilderment and stuckness in that bewilderment. I have a book on my shelf for inspiration sometimes that I turn to in moments like this. It's not from the great poets and sages of ages past. It's a book titled How to Solve It. And it's the work of a mathematician, George Polya. I'm always curious if there are any mathematicians in the house. Any George Polya fans? For you online, there's one nod. All right, his actual contributions to mathematics, say one commentator, are too technical to be understood by non-experts. But this book he writes, called How to Solve It, is all about how do you find the answer to problems when you don't know how to find the answer to problems. His idea is that in mathematical education, at least the little bit of math that I learned, probably you too, we're learning things that have already been proven and whose answers are already known. And it's easy enough to learn something when the answer's already known. You just follow the steps that someone took to get from not knowing to knowing. It's straightforward. But it's much harder to figure out how to answer a problem no one has ever answered before. So his book, How to Solve It, is about 50% math that I do not understand whatsoever, and about 50% a series of suggestions for trying something different when you get stuck. It's like a metaphorical key ring to a locked door. That one didn't work? All right, well, try the next one, try the next one, try the next one. It's not that it's a bad thing to get stuck, he says. You're going to get stuck. In fact, part of the teacher's responsibility to the student is to allow them the experience of getting stuck and finding their way out from getting stuck. It's not always pleasant, but it's good teaching. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. And the thing that you learn is not to stay there forever. You're stumped by the problem. Polya says, well, do you know a related problem to the one you're trying to solve? Something that has some similarity or some aspect of it. He says, can you solve a part of the problem? Even if you can't do the whole thing, is there one little piece of it that you can solve? He says, can you restate the problem? Can you take this thing that looms before you, and now we're leaving mathematics and coming into our own lives. Can you take this thing and restate it in different terms, a different analogy, a different story, a different experience? He says, you're stumped. Did you use all the relevant data? Or are you so focused on this thing right here that you didn't notice there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on that you haven't really grappled with? For Polya, the art of perseverance is not about doing the same thing over and over, expecting that you're going to break through one moment or another. For him, perseverance means this sort of continual sideways motion. This didn't work? Well, what about this? What about this? What about over there? He says, he doesn't actually say this, but I'm saying it. You're cat sitting for a friend, and you show up to their house, and the door is locked. And you know the cat is hungry. You know it needs to be fed, and you can't get in. You don't just stand there knocking at the door because no one's in there, and no matter how much knocking you do, nothing is going to happen. That's not what perseverance looks like. Perseverance means you go around to the back door to see if it's unlocked. You check under the mat for a key. You ring the neighbor's doorbell. You text your friend and say, hey, your door's locked. What's going on? You ask yourself, wait a minute, is this even the right address? Am I at the right address? Is there a cat inside? Can I confirm visually? Perseverance, that is, in math and in our daily life, doesn't mean doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. That's perseveration. And that does keep you stuck. So perseveration means repeating the same word or movement or phrase over and over without there being a stimulus that would provoke that response. So a person, say, with a brain injury, repeats the same word over and over without meaning. But more generally, not in a clinical setting, perseveration is the inability to switch paths. It's an inability to shift off of the track that you're on, the thing you're doing or saying or thinking. It's you knocking at that locked door for hours or years, unable to imagine that there is any other possibility for getting in except for that. And that's not about innate moral character or grit or the will to try something else. If you're stuck in that place, this is not me saying, well, just try harder. You can induce perseveration by stressing someone out. So this group of scientists, this group of possibly very mean scientists in Portugal, ran an experiment in which they stressed out rats. They gave them mild electrical shocks. They periodically and randomly dunked them in water. They kept them in the same cage with bully rats, which are apparently a thing. And these rats then, who were subject to those conditions, would do behaviors that got a reward. They would pull the lever for a squirt of sugar water or a food pellet. And then in those conditions, they wouldn't stop doing that. Stressed rats pull the lever for the food bar even when they don't eat the food. And then inside the little rat brains, researchers could see physical differences. Cage a rat with a bully, dunk it in water, shock it without warning, and the rat's brain changes. The neurons in the part of the brain that make decisions and understand possibility shrink, and the neurons in the habit learning part of the brain get overgrown, over-reinforced. So you stretch on this analogy. You can give George Polya's advice to these rats, assuming they could understand it, and you can tell these rats, inspirational historical stories about perseverance winning over perseveration. But unless you actually change the material conditions of their lives, the brains are not going to change. Another way to say that is that the rats couldn't think themselves into a different way of acting. They had to act themselves into a different way of thinking. The good news, after 4 unstressed weeks, the rats were okay again. Us too, maybe. And I don't really want to anthropomorphize the rats too much, give them human qualities, say they're just like us. Instead, what I want to suggest is that we ratapomorphize the humans. We're a whole lot like those rats, because in the stuck moments, our brains work like them, unable to see any possibilities but the one we've always been doing. And our capacity to perceive possibilities shrinks. Our habits take hold, and we're lost in this fog, thinking that we're moving, going in circles. There's this wonderful study I read about once where they blindfolded the subjects and put them in a big field. I don't know if these scientists were Portuguese or elsewhere. And what they wanted to see is, can you walk a straight line when you have no reference to anything external whatsoever? Turns out you can't. The subjects would walk in these big circles because blindfolded, unable to see where they're going, they went around and around and around. When you're hitting that lever over and over again in your own life, whatever that looks like for you, food or sleep or sex or working harder or rage, it's like a stuckness that you can't get out of. It's like being stuck in quicksand. Quicksand, those of you who grew up in like the 50s and 60s are familiar with quicksand. A few years ago, Radiolab did a special on quicksand, and they put a graph up on their website of the number of mentions of quicksand by decade of the 20th century. And it stays pretty flat in the 20s and 30s, and then a little more in the 40s. And then all of a sudden, in the 1950s, there's this huge upsurge in quicksand mentions. Lawrence of Arabia loses his horse in quicksand. I see the nods here. Lone Ranger has a serious quicksand problem. For those of you of younger generations, quicksand is a non-Newtonian fluid, which means it doesn't quite act like a fluid and it doesn't quite act like a solid. When the stuff is sitting still, it acts like a solid. But when you shake it, when you move it, when you agitate it, it starts to behave like a liquid. If you fill your washing machine with quicksand, this is not a good idea. It would sit there like cement until you turned it on, at which point it would start to move like a liquid. So the advice for escaping quicksand, never let it be said that church isn't a source of practical advice. The advice for escaping quicksand is to move around in it. Don't stay perfectly still. The less you move, the more solid it's going to be. Don't stay still and let it harden around you. Escape a quagmire by moving around in it until you can see the way out. Don't stay still, don't sink. And I don't mean to say that with a sense that that's an easy thing to do in our own lives when we feel stuck. I think the work in that moment is not to either seductively fall into this trap that, well, I'm stuck in this in-between place, but it's inevitably going to be good. I'm fine. Or I'm stuck in this in-between place, and it's inevitably going to be bad. Oh, well. But if that threshold, if that in-between place is such a holy space that it has its own goddess, what is she inviting you to do right there at the crossroads? Sometimes the stuckness is an invitation to gentle perseverance in the moment, to keep trying small changes, not to be wholly still until you can start to see a way out. It's not bad to get stuck. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. And keep moving before the quicksand hardens all the way. Are you stumped by the problem? Well, do you know a related problem to the one that you're facing right now? Can you solve part of the problem that you're facing right now? Can you restate it in different terms, a different analogy, a different story? Did you use all the relevant data to what's going on? Do you have a friend, a mentor, a counselor who can offer fresh perspective? Myths tell, in the language of goddesses and snakes and symbols, the story of our everyday life. In myth, the crossroad is the in-between place where any direction is possible. And it's a moment where you're unavoidably confronted with the reality that you're in between. I don't know what that crossroad is for you right now. It's different for each of us in work, in health, in life stage or age, in parenting, in relationship. And there's not one solution. There's not one answer to that works for everybody. But what we have instead is 1,000 stories from 100 generations of people who tried different things. 100 possibilities, 100 ways to discover where you are, and then to make a choice. The invitation from the goddess of the crossroads is a torch to illuminate possibilities you can't see yet, and a key to open locked doors that have been locked so long you've forgotten they're there. The invitation from the goddess of the crossroads is animals to accompany you, a dog to remind you where you are and warn you of danger and tell you that you're not alone, and a snake to remind you that you can move in any direction, and sometimes the only way to leave the stuck place is to shed your skin and transform. Amen.